Jake started noticing the changes in Emily slowly, but they stacked up like bricks, forming a wall between them. The first hint was subtle: a new blouse here, a different shade of lipstick there. Emily had always been practical about her appearance. Her work in HR didn't demand glamour. Yet, over the past month, her closet seemed to have undergone a quiet revolution. Jake tried to brush it off as her embracing self-care, a phase of indulging in herself. After all, she deserved it. Then came the late nights. Emily's job had its busy seasons, but this was different. Every other evening, she'd text him around 6:30 p.m., saying she had to stay late to finish paperwork or attend impromptu meetings. It wasn't just the frequency but the vagueness that gnawed at Jake. When he asked her for details, she gave curt answers or redirected the conversation entirely. Just onboarding stuff, she'd say with a distracted wave of her hand, her eyes glued to her phone. HR never stops, you know? Her phone itself became another rift. Emily had always been transparent about her devices. They'd casually swap phones if one was charging, or she'd show him memes without hesitation. But now, her phone was practically glued to her hand. She started keeping it face down, even during dinner. Jake didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to notice how quickly she silenced notifications or moved out of view when a call came in. The weekends, which used to be their sanctuary, felt hollow. Emily no longer proposed their ritual Sunday hikes or lazy movie marathons. Instead, she'd make excuses to go out alone. Sometimes it was errands. Other times, she'd claim she needed to clear her head. When Jake offered to join her, she'd decline with a tight smile. "You've been so busy yourself," she'd say. "This is just me time." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight of finality that Jake couldn't challenge. He found himself growing more frustrated and restless, unable to shake the feeling that he was grasping at the shadows of their once vibrant relationship. One evening, Emily came home later than usual. Jake was in the kitchen making spaghetti when he heard the front door creak open. She stepped in, her cheeks flushed and hair slightly tousled, carrying the unmistakable scent of unfamiliar cologne. Jake's heart sank. "You smell different," he remarked casually, his voice betraying a note of accusation. Emily froze, her eyes wide for a fleeting moment before she laughed nervously. "Oh, must be from the new guy at work. He's always dousing himself in cologne. It's unbearable." Jake forced a chuckle but noted how she darted upstairs without lingering. His unease grew into suspicion when Emily started bringing up a name more frequently: Trevor. She mentioned him offhandedly, weaving him into stories about office antics or how he was a lifesaver during a client presentation. Jake couldn't help but feel that Trevor's name came up a little too often. It wasn't jealousy. At least, that's what he told himself. It was the inconsistency. Emily's face would light up when she talked about this Trevor in a way Jake hadn't seen in months. Jake decided to dig a little deeper. The next time Emily claimed she was working late, he drove to her office. He parked his car across the street, convincing himself he was being ridiculous, that he'd find nothing but a dark, empty building. Yet, as he waited, he spotted Emily walking out with a man who fit the vague descriptions she'd given of Trevor: tall, neatly dressed, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that drew eyes. They weren't holding hands, but their body language was intimate. Too intimate. They stopped near the entrance, talking and laughing. Then Trevor reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. She didn't pull away. Jake clenched the steering wheel, his stomach churning. He drove home without confronting her, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this innocent? Was he overreacting? Or was it exactly what it looked like? That night, Emily slid into bed next to him, smelling faintly of perfume she hadn't been wearing earlier that morning. Jake stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubts and dread. He tried to muster the courage to ask her outright, but the words stuck in his throat. The next morning, Emily left early, claiming she had a team meeting. Jake checked her closet after she left. Several outfits he hadn't seen before hung there, expensive and stylish, completely out of character for Emily's typically frugal tastes. One dress still had its tags on, a sleek black number that screamed date night rather than office wear. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, holding the dress in his hands. The realization hit him like a freight train. The distance he felt wasn't imaginary. Something was pulling Emily away, and it wasn't just work stress or personal growth. Later that week, he caught another anomaly. Emily's credit card statement lay on the kitchen counter. Normally, Jake wouldn't pry, but his curiosity got the better of him. Skimming through the transactions, he spotted charges from upscale restaurants and a hotel, places they hadn't visited together. Jake's heart pounded. He photocopied the statement before putting it back, unsure of what to do next. Should he confront her? Accuse her of betrayal? Or was there another explanation, one that didn't involve infidelity? Over the following days, Jake couldn't concentrate at work. He found himself replaying every moment, every excuse, every dismissive laugh. Emily seemed blissfully unaware of his turmoil, her demeanor cheerful but distant, like she was living in a parallel reality where everything was fine. The final straw came when Jake decided to check their shared laptop. He wasn't proud of it, but the need for answers overrode his guilt. Opening the browser, he found a slew of searches that made his blood run cold. How to maintain privacy in relationships, discreet meetup spots, and even a guide to handling guilt. Jake closed the laptop, his hands trembling. The Emily he thought he knew was slipping through his fingers, replaced by someone he barely recognized. The moment I found the first real clue, everything inside me seemed to freeze. It was late on a Friday night, and Emily had gone out again, saying it was another last-minute meeting. Her pattern of being unreachable during these so-called work nights had become so blatant that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Sitting in our quiet living room, the echoes of our happier days seemed to mock me as I stared at the untouched glass of wine in front of me. My gut told me I wasn't crazy. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just my imagination. I pulled out the photocopy of her credit card statement I had stashed away earlier. My eyes landed on a charge from the Meridian Hotel. I knew that place. It wasn't just a hotel. It was the hotel in our city, where couples went for romantic weekends and executives for discreet liaisons. There was no reason for Emily to have a charge there, especially not without me. My chest tightened as I stared at the receipt. A million excuses rushed through my mind, all of them absurd. Maybe it was a work-related expense? Maybe she went there with friends? But the timeline didn't add up. I felt the need to know, to stop guessing and find the truth. So I logged onto our shared bank account online and started digging. Scrolling through months of transactions, a pattern began to emerge. The hotel wasn't the only unusual charge. Upscale dinners at places we'd never been together, boutique purchases from stores that didn't match her usual shopping habits, and odd rideshare trips that ended nowhere near her office or our house. My pulse raced as each detail fit into the growing narrative of betrayal. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, not yet. But the evidence demanded more digging. I opened her laptop, the one we usually shared, hoping for confirmation or, foolishly, a reason to believe I was wrong. Her email was open, and there it was, sitting brazenly in her inbox. A message from her boss, Henry. The subject line read, "Can't wait to see you again." The words seemed to blur as I stared at the screen. My heart pounded as I clicked the message, my hands shaking. Emily, tonight was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. Thank you for taking the risk and making time for me despite everything. You're incredible, and I feel lucky to have you in my life. Yours, Henry. I leaned back in the chair, the breath knocked out of me. A rush of anger, sadness, and disbelief surged through me all at once. I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. Her late nights, the distant stares, the evasive answers, they weren't random. They were deliberate. This wasn't just some passing mistake or misunderstanding. She was involved with him, her boss, Henry. I scrolled further through their exchanges. There were dozens of them, each one more damning than the last. They weren't even trying to hide it. Messages detailing romantic dinners, plans for future trips, and even complaints about how difficult it was for her to keep lying to me. One message, in particular, burned itself into my brain. I wish I could tell Jake the truth, she had written. He doesn't deserve this, but I can't lose what we have. Henry's reply had been even worse. He'll never find out, Emily. I'll make sure of it. You're too important to me. Too important? My blood boiled at the arrogance. He wasn't just stealing my wife, he was treating me like an afterthought, a fool left in the dark while they played their little game. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, staring at the messages. Time seemed to blur, and the quiet of the house became suffocating. Finally, I forced myself to keep digging. If I was going to confront Emily, I needed every shred of proof. I found more than I bargained for. In a folder labeled Work Docs, tucked away among innocuous spreadsheets and reports, were photos. They weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. Pictures of Emily and Henry at the hotel bar, laughing over cocktails. A shot of them walking hand in hand down a quiet street. And the worst, a selfie of the two of them in what was clearly a hotel room. She was wearing the sleek black dress I'd found in her closet, the one she'd never worn for me. He was standing behind her, his arms around her waist, both of them grinning like teenagers sneaking away from the world. I slammed the laptop shut, my head spinning. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown relationship. And I was the idiot husband who'd been left to piece it all together. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, every creak of the floorboards echoing in my ears. When Emily finally came home, it was past midnight. She smelled faintly of wine and perfume, her makeup still perfectly intact. She smiled at me, a tired but content look on her face, as if she'd just come from a harmless night with coworkers. "Hey," she said softly, dropping her bag on the counter. "You're still up?" I wanted to scream, to throw the laptop at her and demand answers. But instead, I forced myself to stay calm. "Yeah," I replied, my voice unnervingly steady. "Just couldn't sleep." She nodded absently, brushing past me toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted. Let's talk in the morning, okay?" I watched her go, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. It took everything in me not to explode right then and there. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of her shower running. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months, every lie she'd told, every moment she'd chosen him over me. I had all the evidence I needed. The question now was what to do with it. As I got up and started making coffee, Emily came downstairs, wrapped in her usual morning robe. She greeted me with a peck on the cheek, the same way she always did, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. And she didn't know that I knew. The first time I thought about reaching out to Molly, Henry's wife, I hesitated. I didn't know her beyond the glimpses I'd caught at a couple of office parties over the years, polished, kind, and seemingly devoted to her family. I wrestled with the decision for hours. Was it even fair to drag her into this? But every time I looked at the messages between Emily and Henry, or the photo of them wrapped around each other, my anger pushed me forward. I found her number in an old company contact list Emily had emailed me ages ago. My hands trembled as I typed out a text. "Hi Molly, this is Jake, Emily's husband. I need to speak with you about something important regarding Henry and Emily. Please let me know when you're available." It felt like an eternity before she replied, though it was only 15 minutes. Her message was short. "Jake, what's this about? Is something wrong?" I didn't trust myself to explain over text. I called her immediately. She picked up after the second ring, her voice tinged with confusion and worry. "Jake, what's going on?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Molly, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but I think Henry and Emily are involved." My voice cracked slightly at the end, and I hated how small I sounded. There was a long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but composed. "Are you sure?" she asked. "That's a serious accusation." "I wouldn't come to you if I wasn't sure," I said, then explained everything: Emily's late nights, the hotel charges, the messages, the photos. I offered to send her the proof, but she stopped me. "No," she said quietly. "I believe you. I've had my suspicions too." Hearing her admit that hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just my marriage falling apart, hers was crumbling too. Molly took a deep breath, then said, "We need to be smart about this, Jake. If they've been lying to us this long, they'll deny it unless we corner them." I agreed, though the idea of working with Molly felt surreal. This woman, who until now had been little more than a stranger, suddenly became my partner in unraveling the deceit that had infiltrated both our lives. Over the next week, Molly and I teamed up to gather more evidence. She had access to Henry's phone records, which painted an even clearer picture of his betrayal. There were dozens of calls and texts between him and Emily, many of them during hours he'd claimed to be working late or traveling for business. Molly also found a credit card bill with charges to the same hotel I'd flagged, the Meridian. "Do you think they're meeting there regularly?" I asked during one of our late-night calls. "Almost certainly," Molly replied. "He's been distant for months, always saying he's too tired or busy. Now I know why." The bitterness in her voice mirrored my own. We traded details like detectives piecing together a case. Molly even managed to recover deleted photos from Henry's cloud account, more damning evidence of their secret meetings. One night, Molly called me sounding breathless. "Jake, I think I've got something big." Henry left his tablet at home, and it's synced to his email. "There's a reservation for the Meridian tomorrow night at 7:30. For two." My stomach turned. "So they're planning to meet?" "Looks like it," she said grimly. "I'm going to confront him there. You should do the same with Emily." The thought of seeing them together made my blood boil, but I agreed. This was our chance to catch them red-handed. The following evening, I told Emily I had a late meeting. She barely reacted, too busy scrolling on her phone to notice my forced calm. I left the house around 7 o'clock, driving to the Meridian with my heart pounding in my chest. Molly was already waiting in the parking lot when I arrived. She looked as tense as I felt, her hands gripping the strap of her purse tightly. "They're not here yet," she said, glancing at the entrance. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I muttered. We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 7:30, a car pulled up and out stepped Henry, followed closely by Emily. They were laughing, oblivious to the storm about to hit them. Emily looked radiant in a red dress I'd never seen before, while Henry placed a hand on the small of her back as they walked inside. I felt a surge of anger so intense I thought I might explode. Molly touched my arm. "We stick to the plan," she reminded me. "No scenes until we have them cornered." We followed them into the hotel lobby, keeping a safe distance. They didn't even check in at the front desk. They clearly knew their way around. Molly and I trailed them to the elevator, watching as they rode up to the 7th floor. Molly's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "Room 712, she whispered. "That's what the reservation said." We waited a few minutes before heading up ourselves. I don't think I've ever been more nervous in my life. Molly led the way, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted hallway. When we reached the door to room 712, she knocked firmly. There was a pause, then muffled voices inside. The door opened slightly, and Henry's face appeared. His expression shifted from surprise to horror when he saw Molly standing there. "Molly? What are you?" "Move," she snapped, pushing past him into the room. I followed close behind. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with shock. "Jake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, sitting there like a deer caught in headlights. "You've got some explaining to do," I said coldly. Henry tried to intervene, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Look, this isn't what it looks like." "Oh, shut up," Molly cut him off, her voice sharp. "We know everything. The messages, the photos, the hotel bills. Don't insult us by pretending." Emily buried her face in her hands, while Henry stammered excuses that neither of us cared to hear. Molly turned to me, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Let's leave them to stew," she said. "They've made their bed. Now they can lie in it." As we walked out, I felt an odd sense of relief. The confrontation wasn't the end, it was just the beginning, but at least now, the lies were exposed. The idea of a public confrontation hadn't been my first choice. At first, I'd imagined handling it quietly, maybe just Emily and me in our kitchen, or sitting down with Molly and Henry to lay it all bare. But after seeing Emily and Henry's sheer arrogance, the way they carried on like their deceit was untouchable, something inside me shifted. Molly agreed. "They think they're untouchable," she had said. "Let's show them they're not." So we planned it carefully. Molly had overheard Henry mention their favorite restaurant during one of their secret calls. It was a trendy bistro downtown, dim lighting, intimate tables, the perfect place for a secret rendezvous. She checked his calendar and confirmed he had a meeting scheduled there with Emily. That was all we needed. The night of the confrontation, I arrived early. Molly and I chose a table tucked away near the back but with a clear view of the entrance. The air buzzed with quiet conversation and the clinking of glasses. It felt surreal, sitting there and knowing what was about to happen. "They're going to hate us for this," Molly said, her voice low but steady. I nodded. Good. At exactly 7:15, they walked in. Emily wore a sleek black dress, the same one she'd worn in the photos I'd found on her laptop. Henry was dressed in a crisp suit, his hand casually resting on the small of her back as they laughed and whispered like teenagers sneaking out past curfew. My stomach churned at the sight, but I stayed calm, watching as they were led to a table near the center of the room. "Showtime," Molly murmured. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to the photos and messages we'd collected. We had everything. The texts, the call logs, the receipts, even the photo of them in the hotel room. There would be no denying it. I stood up first, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. Molly followed close behind as we walked across the restaurant, our footsteps deliberate. Emily spotted me first. Her face went pale, and she froze, her fork hovering midair. Henry noticed her reaction and turned, his expression shifting from confusion to panic as he saw Molly. What are you doing here?" Emily stammered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the restaurant. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out a printed copy of one of their messages and slapped it on the table. The diners nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. "This," I said, my voice cold and steady. "This is what we're doing here." Emily's eyes darted to the paper, then to me. "Jake, I can explain." "Don't," I cut her off. "You've been lying to me for months. There's nothing you can say that will make this better." Molly stepped forward, her eyes blazing as she turned her attention to Henry. "You sneaking around, destroying 2 families. Did you really think you'd get away with it?" Henry started to speak, but Molly wasn't having it. She placed her phone on the table, the screen lit up with the photo of him and Emily in the hotel room. "Recognize this?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "Because I do." By now, the restaurant had gone quiet. All eyes were on us. The other diners exchanged whispers and glances, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident demeanor crumbling. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing around. "We don't need to make a scene." Molly laughed bitterly. "Oh, Henry, we're way past that. You made the scene the moment you decided to cheat." Emily reached out to touch my arm, her face a mask of desperation. "Jake, please. Can we talk about this privately?" I pulled back, my voice rising. "Privately? You mean like all the private moments you've had with him?" "No, Emily. You don't get to control this anymore." Henry tried to regain some control, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "Let's all just calm down, okay? We're adults here." "Adults?" I snapped. "You've been acting like teenagers sneaking around behind everyone's back. Don't you dare talk to me about being an adult." The tension was palpable, the air thick with anger and shame. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. She'd made her choices. Molly and I had spent weeks piecing together the truth, and now it was laid bare for everyone to see. "I trusted you," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay composed. "For years, I trusted you. And this is what you do? You throw it all away for him?" Emily sobbed quietly, but Henry stayed silent, his jaw clenched as he stared at the table. Molly wasn't done, though. She picked up the stack of evidence we'd brought and placed it in front of him. "You can lie to us all you want," she said, her voice sharp as a knife. "But this doesn't lie. You've ruined everything." The whispers around the restaurant grew louder, diners craning their necks to get a better look. I could feel the weight of their stares, but I didn't care. Let them see. Let them know what kind of people Emily and Henry were. The manager approached cautiously, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, clearly uneasy about the growing spectacle. "No," Molly said firmly. "But we're done." She turned on her heel and walked out, her head held high. I followed, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and relief. Behind us, I heard Emily's voice, barely audible. "Please, I didn't look back. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The fallout came faster than I expected. What started as a confrontation at the restaurant spiraled into something neither Emily nor Henry could have anticipated. I thought it would end with the exposure of their affair, but it turned into a storm that destroyed not just our marriages but their careers and reputations as well. The morning after the restaurant confrontation, I woke up to find Emily gone. She'd packed a bag and left a note on the counter. "I need time to think. Please don't contact me right now." It was laughable, really. She needed time? She'd had months sneaking around with Henry to think. Now it was my turn to decide how to move forward. Molly called me later that day, her voice steady but cold. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. "And I'm reporting Henry to the board." It turned out that Molly, ever the meticulous planner, had been holding on to another secret, evidence of financial misconduct. She'd suspected Henry of skimming funds for months, and their affair gave her the final push to dig deeper. With access to their shared accounts and Henry's work expenses, she uncovered a trail of irregularities. Hotel stays, lavish dinners, and even gifts, all charged to the company under vague descriptions like client meetings or business development. "I'm not just letting him walk away from this," Molly said. "If he wants to ruin lives, he can face the consequences." I supported her fully. Emily and Henry didn't just betray us, they'd betrayed the trust of everyone around them. If they thought they could carry on without repercussions, they were sorely mistaken. Molly submitted the evidence to Henry's company's compliance department, detailing the affair and financial improprieties. She didn't hold back, including screenshots of texts and photos proving their secret rendezvous. Meanwhile, I made a similar report to Emily's HR department, sharing how her actions with a superior had violated company policies. The investigations began swiftly. Within a week, Emily was called into a meeting with HR, and Henry faced the same at his firm. I didn't hear about Emily's reaction directly. She wasn't speaking to me, but mutual friends filled in the gaps. Apparently, she'd been blindsided, claiming the relationship had nothing to do with her work performance. It didn't matter. The evidence was too strong. Henry's situation was even worse. As a senior executive, his misconduct carried far greater consequences. Molly's report triggered a full audit, uncovering years of questionable expenses. The affair with Emily became the least of his problems as auditors uncovered more extravagant spending and even signs of personal loans disguised as company expenses. The news didn't stay private for long. Gossip spread quickly within both companies, and soon it reached their broader social circles. Colleagues whispered about Emily and Henry at happy hours, and invitations to events dried up. Even the ones who had initially tried to sympathize with them backed off when the financial scandal became public knowledge. I heard through a mutual friend that Emily had been escorted out of the office by security after her termination. Henry didn't fare much better. He was fired shortly after, his dismissal accompanied by a scathing internal memo about ethical violations. Their names were blacklisted within their industries almost overnight. Socially, the fallout was brutal. Emily, who had always been the life of the party, found herself cut off from nearly everyone. Friends who had once admired her for her charm and wit now avoided her calls, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. I learned from one of her former friends that Emily had tried to explain herself, blaming me for being distant and unsupportive. But the excuses fell flat. People weren't buying it, especially not after the full story of her affair with Henry became common knowledge. Henry faced similar isolation. His colleagues, many of whom had admired his success, now saw him as a fraud. Molly told me he tried to reach out to a few close friends, but they politely declined to meet, unwilling to jeopardize their own reputations by associating with him. Even his family, who had always supported him unconditionally, seemed to distance themselves. Molly and I became unlikely allies during this period. We weren't exactly friends, but we checked in on each other occasionally. She was handling the divorce proceedings with a quiet determination that I admired. I, on the other hand, was still navigating the emotional wreckage of my marriage. Emily had reached out once, a brief email asking if we could talk things through. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The last I heard about Henry, he was trying to start over in another city, far from the mess he'd created. Molly sold their house and kept the majority of their shared assets in the divorce settlement. She was doing well, all things considered, focusing on her career and rebuilding her life. As for Emily, she moved in with a cousin for a while, trying to piece together what was left of her life. She sent a few more emails over the months, each one more desperate than the last. In one, she apologized for everything, claiming she'd made a terrible mistake and begging for another chance. In another, she lashed out, blaming me for involving her workplace and ruining her career. I didn't respond to any of them. I'd like to say I felt some satisfaction watching their downfall, but the truth is, it was bittersweet. There was no joy in seeing someone I'd once loved brought so low, even if she'd brought it on herself. What I did feel, though, was relief. The lies were over, the secrets laid bare. I could finally move forward, even if it meant starting over from scratch. Months later, I found myself at the same restaurant where Molly and I had confronted them. I was there with a couple of friends, laughing over drinks and trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. As I looked around the room, I realized how much lighter I felt. Emily and Henry's betrayal had left scars, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had taught me the value of truth and the strength to walk away from those who couldn't honor it.